Hello everyone, my name is Mr. Gentleman and we are here to do one thing and one thing only, and that is discuss Phantasy Star. This video is part of an ongoing series of in-depth reviews and analysis of RPGs. Note that this review is based on the original Master System version, though all remakes will be discussed. When people hear names like Yuji Naka, Naoto Oshima, and Reiko Kodama, the first thing they think of is a certain mascot that leaves blue streaks and speeds by, but unfortunately doesn't seem to do that these days. But before that, these Sega A-listers created one of the first console RPGs. The year is 1987. Dragon Quest II outsold its hit predecessor by almost 1 million copies. The Japanese market's response to this, strangely enough, rather than capitalize on this new burgeoning subgenre, is to make action RPGs and mimic American dungeon crawlers. Two companies with a better business sense for understanding public demand would better read the writing on the wall and would begin work on their own respective games. Sega, deciding that it needed to have an RPG in order to compete with Nintendo, began to solicit game design ideas. Chieko Aoki, who would become the game's writer, explained concepts she had for a story. Her ideas and dialogue were things she was deeply interested in creating, and from the start the team had a lot to work with. Kotaro Hayashida and Miki Morimoto were the game's head designers. According to Hayashida, he wanted to create something the Nintendo Famicom or NES technology could not handle, which led to the creation of a lot of unique ideas, such as the game's memorable 3D dungeons. Yuji Naka, future head of Sega's Sonic team and the game's head programmer, made said dungeons possible. The title Phantasy Star was also his idea, having derived it from famed Japanese pop star Noriko Sakai's song Beachside Fantasy. Reiko Kodama, known for the art of Alex Kidd, and who would be later known for work on the Sonic games and Skies of Arcadia, Takao Kawaguchi, and Naoto Oshima, the artist behind Sonic himself, would be Phantasy Star's artists, who all contributed to some of the most detailed designs in RPGs at the time. The ambition of the Phantasy Star team to create something unique was made evident by how many of the game's concepts were ahead of their time. The title was an interplanetary space-faring adventure that originally allowed you to travel between 4 planets, but due to memory limitations, 3 planets in the final version. As we will discuss, the graphics, the sprite work, the animations, the combat, and certain aspects of the characters and story would all contain things explicitly done in order to be more unconventional compared to many games at the time. Much of this was made possible by using a card that used 4 megabits of ROM, which was far larger than most Master System games at the time. Phantasy Star would be released on December 20th, 1987, 1 week after Square would release Final Fantasy. The game would be localized for North America and Europe the following year. As mentioned earlier, Phantasy Star manages to stand out among the early wave of console RPGs precisely because it's trying to be different. Phantasy Star is a fantasy game, but in space. The game's story is about avenging your brother who was killed by the evil emperor, but the vengeful protagonist in question is Alice Landale, a female protagonist, appearing only 1 year after Samus Aran made her debut. The game is a console RPG, but it really wants to be a first-person dungeon crawler. And the game wants to be a first-person dungeon crawler, but what first-person dungeon crawler managed to look this good back in 1987? To begin with the usual, battles occur through random encounters, which take you to a first-person battle screen. This can occur anytime while on the overworld or in dungeons. The menu consists of the usual suspects, such as your basic attack command, spells, items, running, but it also has this really unusual talk command. If you run into an intelligent being and use talk, you'll get a bit of flavor text before the enemy leaves. It actually adds some personality to the game. But overall, combating consists of attacking, using magic when necessary, and going all out against bosses, which includes using basic buffs and debuffs. While the combat is basic to our modern eyes, I remind you that this was new to the general masses in the 1980s. Your party would consist of the balanced protagonist, the physical bruiser, and the mage, but once you reach the talking space cat, you realize this game has a few caveats. Alice is a pretty strong attacker. She learns the 2 weakest offensive and healing spells, but also manages to learn a few unique abilities such as Fly, which allows you to return to the last church you visited. She's also the only one who could equip the game's ultimate equipment. Meow is interesting. He has great attack power, especially if you go out of your way to get his unique equipment. He learns the strongest healing spell in the game almost immediately. He also has a few unique spells to him. Wall, which protects against certain attacks, Help, which buffs an ally's strength, Terror, which lowers an enemy's attack, and Trap, which is necessary to undo floor traps. There is no doubt that Meow was built as, and is, the most unique character on your team. Odin is your bruiser who deals the most physical damage, but even he has some special attributes. Rather than arming Odin with an axe or a sword, you can give him a gun. While normal attacks like kitty paws hit one enemy, guns will fire at every enemy. But rather than calculating damage, they deal a set amount. The needle gun delivers 5 to everyone, the heat gun 10, and the laser gun hits for 20. With the exception of the first gun, which both Alice and Odin can equip, all guns can be equipped only by Odin. Choosing between having Odin be a very strong striker or do spread damage adds a nice layer of customization. Noah learns both healing and defensive spells. Because magic is really powerful, it will make him the biggest damage dealer against bosses. Some offensive spells work similarly to guns, but have their own quirks. Spells will fire multiple shots, such as fire launching 2 and wind launching 3. However, who they hit is random. Wind may hit the same person 3 times, may hit the same person twice and hit another, or it may hit 3 different enemies. Phantasy Star's battles are not lacking in difficulty. They could be tough and even be unforgiving. While you had a decent degree of combat options in support and offensive magic, what truly made the game difficult were the long dungeons where rationing MP was pivotal. Preparation for all battles you would go through in terms of remembering to bring healing and support items with you wasn't an option, it was a necessity. However, I am critical about how limited the MP pools are. I'm all for games that limit your MP to force you to fight carefully, but I feel in Phantasy Star, they're limited to the point that you want to avoid using spells altogether in dungeons, which means you spend most of your battles just attacking over and over again, which can get very boring. Having to not use the game's systems, honestly, is simply not fun at all. Regardless, the sheer difficulty of the fights and the unique enemies whose attack styles you have to learn do keep things exciting. When it comes to grinding, the first thing you're expected to do after starting up the game is grind a few levels. For the most RPGs of the 8-bit generation, they would at least start you off with easy enemies, but the game's merciless nature shows itself early on. While you'll run into mostly simple enemies, the game has no qualms about throwing in enemies that can slaughter Alice at a low level. I wouldn't say the rest of the game is grindy. It more or less expects that you'll enter a dungeon, make some progress in figuring out where to go and where not to go, then retreating when your MP and resources get low. By the time you figure the dungeon out, you should be a good enough level by the end. Personally, I can only remember one spot where I had to dedicate myself to intense grinding outside of the game's beginning. One of the things I really like is that the pause menu and the battle screen always use the same backgrounds. It makes it feel less like you're being taken to a separate battle screen, and more like one mode is the first-person view that the characters see, and the other is a third-person view. It works well and creates more immersion. Phantasy Star's economy is very similar to, though a little different, to Dragon Quest. Shops will sell various tiers of weapons and armor. Unlike Dragon Quest, however, shops usually only sell one type of equipment, and 3 tiers of set equipment. The philosophy is the same, however. You must choose how to spend your money wisely, whether you want to skip a tier of equipment, whether you want to forgo buying a weapon for now to save up for something better, and whether you want to prioritize offense or defense. Added on top of this are items like the magic lamp. Whenever you enter a dungeon, you must buy a flash every time to light it up, or you can buy the one-time purchase but somewhat expensive magic lamp. I love it when RPGs challenge you with their economy, as it leads to a better role-playing experience in terms of decision-making. Also, since this game takes place in the future, Coke and Big Macs take on the role of your healing items, and while most weapons, aside from Kitty Fangs, are rooted in the fantasy genre, certain weapons like lightsabers are available for purchase. Phantasy Star's exploration, like in many console-style RPGs, has the overworld and cities traversed using a top-down view. When it comes to exploration, the game's design is very open, immediately allowing you to move around at your leisure. The game doesn't hold your hand, so you're free to search for how to advance and find all sorts of hidden areas. However, don't confuse open design with non-linearity. For example, you can go to various areas you're not supposed to, but that doesn't mean you can progress the story since you usually need a special item in order to do so. However, in almost a Metroidvania-like manner, the game informs you when you need to obtain something in order to progress. For example, you can find Meow, who has the medicine to heal petrification, before finding Odin, but most players will probably find the statue-fied Odin first, informing them that they must look for a way to free him. Later in the game, some non-linearity does open up, with you being able to find the endgame equipment at your leisure, but that's about it. The biggest innovation in terms of exploration is that Phantasy Star has you traveling between 3 different planets. Palma, the Earth-like planet, Motavia, the desert planet, and Dezoris, the ice planet. This allows for new terrain to explore, new challenges to deal with, new natives to interact with, and new kinds of enemies to deal with, depending on what planet you are on. Each map in and of themselves are actually pretty small, but when taken together, they do make it so that you have a lot of ground to explore and investigate. Over the course of the game, you'll gain various forms of transportation, but rather than just a ship, this game grants you use of futuristic vehicles. Basically, the game creates a few obstacles that can only be traversed by special means. The first vehicle is the hovercraft, which can cross water and lava. The second is the Land Rover, which can cross over antlions. The last is the Ice Digger, which can break through weak layers of ice. However, my issue is how little use these vehicles have. You only have to deal with set obstacles a small number of times. Even if they allow for faster movement, I really didn't see why you couldn't just have one vehicle, which gains special attachments you have to find or buy in order to cover all three vehicles' uses. Also, they take up room in the item menu, which I could be using to stock more Whopper Juniors to heal my party. Where Phantasy Star's exploration truly shines, however, is in the dungeons. However, unlike what many Phantasy Star aficionados would have you believe, the concept wasn't original. After all, PC RPGs did this for years, and many Japanese dungeon crawlers of the time were trying to mimic them. What gives Phantasy Star its own identity, however, is that it manages to integrate first-person dungeon crawling into the console-style RPG subgenre that Dragon Quest was making popular. These areas can get very difficult and very complex. Graph paper will be a necessity for this game if you're not using a guide. The second to last dungeon is a grueling marathon, which takes you up a few floors, then down to the basement, then all the way up to the top floor. I really don't have much else to say. That's not a bad thing. It's just that the few words I said is all that needs to be said about how exciting and energetic these dungeons are. One thing I wish to both praise and critique is how enemies appear. I love how suddenly enemies can show up in dungeons, and how the music abruptly changes. And I absolutely adore how the enemies can pop up when you simply turn, or even after you open up a treasure chest. However, I dislike the way enemies show up in the overworld. The lack of a sound effect to inform you of an enemy appearing makes it feel anticlimactic and unnatural. Phantasy Star's story follows Alice Landale, a young orphan who is powerless to stop the Emperor Lassic's thugs from killing her older brother Nero. Nero tells his younger sister to seek out a man named Odin for help. Alice, desiring revenge, goes on a journey to find Odin and discover a way to assassinate Lassic. In the era before FMV cutscenes, Phantasy Star surprised many people with its anime-style illustrations. These helped establish important moments, such as meeting new party members, but most importantly to gamers at the time, they managed to convey pathos, allowing you to understand Alice's sadness and tragedy before you began to roleplay as her. However, most of the story is investigative, much like Dragon Quest. Talking to everyone you meet is crucial. Their information is pivotal in order to learn how to progress and what to do with certain plot items. Phantasy Star's events are a little more involved than the first two Dragon Quest games, and playing out this adventure was compelling for its time. Of course, by today's standards, the overall plotting is thin, and as expected of an 8-bit era game, each individual event isn't very fleshed out. Much of the game is give item A to person B to get to location C to advance the plot. You find a statue of Odin, you get a valuable pot, you trade it to free Odin's sidekick Meow, you use the medicine around his neck to unstone Odin, you travel to the planet Motavia, and here the governor hates Lassic's corruption, but you can't meet with him unless you have sweets. You find a cake, you make a deal with the governor, you recruit Noah, you head back to Palma. The TSA takes away your passport. You have to recruit a mad scientist in order to build a spaceship, and then you can go on to find the Laconian equipment. That really is the plot for most of the game. But again, it must have been fascinating for players at the time to be able to go on this adventure that spanned continents over multiple worlds. Another thing that really stands out are the little details. One of the earliest things Alice has to do is get a fake ID, and right after that, she has to pass a medical exam and pay money to get a passport. It's strange, but I think that sort of thing really puts you in the experience of role-playing someone who has the world against her. The only universal complaint I have is how silly some of the game's events are. You have to travel down a tough 4-basement dungeon to purchase a cake. Why do you have a cake shop in a dungeon full of deadly monsters? Another person threw away a perfectly good hovercraft. Why? And the good doctor here acts like he's in jail because he feels like it, and even refuses to leave to make a spaceship for you, even though you're freeing him. This game can be really weird at times. Where Phantasy Star shined to people back in 1987 was in the world that Phantasy Star built. The Algol star system is a mix between medieval fantasy, swords and dragons, with science fiction, faraway planets, and futuristic technology, which is what helped this game stand out. On one hand, you had this fantasy overworld with untamed forests and monsters. On the other, you had some really unique ideas, such as elevated cities connected by moving walkways. You had both ancient dungeons and space Wendy's. I'm rather fond of the armor and clothing, which are fantasy in nature, but are streamlined for an ultra-modern society. The story's tropes do the same thing. The game makes a big deal about Laconia, a special and even holy metal that makes up the best equipment. On the other hand, the game is rife with Star Wars homages. Stormtroopers try to enforce a dictatorship, the Jawas are apparently just misunderstood, and all of Matavia seems to be a reference to Tatooine. Impressive, however, is Phantasy Star's endgame. Warning, endgame spoilers ahead. After traversing a very long dungeon, you end up at the top. Using the prism, you receive a moment that was incredible to many gamers in the 80s. Just as surprising as what happens after. After giving Meow the nut from the Llama tree, he suddenly grows wings and you can fly up to the Sky Castle, but only after fighting a golden dragon. Amusingly, if Meow dies during this fight, everyone dies because no one is there to carry them in the sky. I always enjoy little details such as that, even when they're cruel to you. After defeating Lastic, you find that the game isn't over. After returning to the Matavia Governor's mansion, you suddenly end up in another dungeon. When you reach the final room, this is Dark Force, but due to either mistranslation or lack of text box space, Dark Faults. Upon defeating him, you find out that Alice is actually the daughter of the king before Lastic, and the governor will help you in your reign as the new queen. However, at the end of the game I found myself asking, wait, how did Alice not know who her parents were? The ending had me asking all kinds of questions. Even though I've stated in this review that Alice is an orphan, the game never actually says that. It's the manual that tells you this. In fact, it's the manual that tells you a lot of things that aren't in the game. I thought this was the kind of thing that late 80s RPGs were trying to leave behind. Considering console RPGs were doing their best to include all the story elements in the game proper, unlike Western dungeon crawlers, this is very disappointing. But I'm left with even more questions. If Lastic was a good king before he became an evil king, then what was the need in making Alice and Nero live without knowledge of their parents? It's honestly all a little contrived. But other than that, the story is sufficient, and again I stress that for the late 80s, this was quite the experience, especially for the Master System owners who were experiencing RPGs for the first time. If you haven't already noticed, one thing that truly stands out in this 1987 classic are the graphics and art design. Yuji Naka did a fantastic job milking all he could out of the 4 megabit cartridge. The 3D dungeons, or more accurately, the dungeons with the illusion of being 3D, are an impressive feat. I don't think that any first-person dungeon crawler managed to look this great and this immersive at the time. As mentioned before, the illustrations do a great job of depicting who these characters are. The fully sized human images for when you enter shops and houses are also well done for the time. Another feat of Phantasy Star is how well drawn some of the sprites are. The humans manage to be more detailed and larger than anything at the time. But the real standout artwork is with the monsters. Entering battle and seeing these full-size portraits, sometimes taking up much of the screen, really shows off how good the art design is. All the monsters are incredibly well drawn and all have this dark sort of viciousness to them. They also help give the game an identity. For example, let's compare slimes. The slime of wizardry looks like something out of a Western fantasy story for sure. The Dragon Quest slime in its simplicity immediately reminds one of Akira Toriyama's art style. The slime in Phantasy Star lacks any kind of facial features, has a dark color scheme, which along with its erratic, sudden, and violent movements, makes it feel like a hostile alien creature, which is fitting for a game which takes place in outer space. Many of the monsters do this, feeling like they're sci-fi versions of fantasy beasts, thus helping in the story's world building. But I can't help but mention one of the more disappointing things about the game graphically, and that's the game regressed to only showing one monster to represent multiple monsters like in older computer RPGs. I wonder if having all of these detailed backgrounds and animated sprites was taking up so much power that the sprites of multiple enemies had to be sacrificed. Another thing done because no one was doing it at the time were monsters having movement. It looks interesting and even creepy. I also really love the full, well-drawn backgrounds that many NES titles at the time were not capable of. They're all immersive and even beautiful at times. All the environments are really colorful and do everything to take advantage of the Master System's color palette. Expanding upon that, the use of color, just like with the monsters, really works to make areas feel like they're science fiction versions of medieval backdrops. Phantasy Star has had a number of re-releases and remakes after its original Master System release. The first is the Phantasy Star Collection, as part of the Sega Ages series for the Sega Saturn. The collection contained the first 4 games in the series, and each game is virtually identical to their original versions. A full remake of the first Phantasy Star was created as the first entry in the Sega Ages 3200 series, entitled Phantasy Star Generation 1. This version has enough differences that one day I'd like to cover it separately. However, for now I will say that it featured a complete visual makeover. You can now see your characters from behind, and see a short animation. Each enemy has their own sprite. Different types of enemies can partake in battle. New anime cutscenes have been created. All of the dungeons have been given a more unique look to each of them. And a few new gameplay mechanics such as gems have been added. While I think the actual artwork is excellent, and some of the new gameplay elements are interesting, the animations and color scheme make it look like a Flash game, or something made in RPG Maker. A version of the Phantasy Star Collection containing only the first 3 games would be released for the Game Boy Advance. Also released as a 32nd entry of the Sega Ages 2500 series was the Phantasy Star Complete Collection. This is generally considered to be the collection with the best emulation. What's nice is that the game has English options, so if you play imported PS2 games, this is an excellent option. Phantasy Star is available on the Nintendo Wii's Virtual Console. The game is also unlockable in the Sonic Genesis collection for the PS3 and the Xbox 360, though note that some people find the emulation of the Phantasy Star games to be less than perfect. The PS2 version of the Phantasy Star Collection and Phantasy Star Generation 1 are also available on PSN, but in Japan only. Upon release, Phantasy Star was critically acclaimed. Many claim that it set a new standard for future RPG titles, and that it may represent the future of console gaming. Praise for its graphical superiority compared to other RPGs was often noted. Even though Dragon Quest II was the first game to have predefined player characters rather than blank slates, Phantasy Star's characters had backstories, and were somewhat more fleshed out, making them a little more noteworthy. And of course, Alice is noted for being one of the earliest female protagonists in video games. Phantasy Star's more popular sequels eventually made the first game a curiosity as well, making it more popular now than it ever was upon release. I personally enjoyed Phantasy Star precisely because of just how willing it was to be strange and quirky. The sci-fi crossed with medieval fantasy setting continues to be noteworthy to this day. The animations and art design are very impressive. The art is definitely some of the best of its era. I can really go on about how impressed I am with the monster designs. Each element, from the way monsters are drawn, to the environments, to the kinds of weapons you can get, all play a part in world building, which is wonderful. And the dungeons, like many of the era, are not afraid to lead you to dead ends, and tell you that you need to learn how this place works, or it's going to eat you alive. I'm going to be honest. In terms of franchises, I generally prefer Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy over Phantasy Star. I am very mechanically focused and a gameplay-driven person, so while Phantasy Star is certainly better than the first 2 Dragon Quest games, Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest III, in my opinion, are the superior titles. However, it would simply be unfair to write off the Phantasy Star games. The first entry manages to have its own identity and wears it proudly, where Dragon Quest has top-down exploration and first-person battles, and Final Fantasy is completely top-down. Phantasy Star injects first-person dungeon crawling into a console RPG, and it does it with its own style and flair. The game is full of interesting aspects, ranging from support magic kitty cats to great visual and gameplay-driven world building that made the algorithm Algol star system feel alive. So many people forget the Phantasy Star games even exist when talking about the history of RPGs. Phantasy Star deserves to be mentioned as part of the early era of RPG gaming. Its innovations and attention to detail deserve to be remembered. In an era where there were so many obvious Dragon Quest clones, the Algol star system still manages to shine brightly. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the History of RPGs. Next time, we shall cover Hironobu Sakaguchi's classic, Final Fantasy. Thank you for watching, and God bless you all.